we're going to cover chapter 28, The Triumph of Conservatism, the End of the Cold War, and the Rise of the New World Order from 1980 to 1992. In this chapter, it's kind of short, considering the sections that we're going to go over. We're going to talk about the Reagan Revolution, Reagan, the End of the Cold War from 81 to 88, and the presidency of George H.W. Bush from 89 to 93. So we will get right into it. So the New Right saw a significant triumph when Ronald Reagan won the presidency in 1980. So Reagan, he was a former Hollywood actor. He was also the governor of California and a social and economic conservative. Reagan embraced tax cuts, spending reductions, and easing of federal civil rights regulations, and an end to affirmative action and remaining Great Society programs. He also supported a range of Christian conservative programs. Economic reform was Reagan's first focus, and he advocated what he called Reaganomics, a strategy inspired by supply-side theorists that called for reductions in government spending, huge tax cuts, and a lowering of lending rates. Reagan was inspired by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and also West German Chancellor Kohl, both of whom embraced conservative economic policies such as cutting government spending and lowering taxes. His popularity, Reagan's that is, soared after he was shot by a would-be assassin in 1981, and he was able to push Congress to pass economic reforms. At first, the measures led to a spike in unemployment, but inflation rates eventually fell, and the unemployment rate followed, and the gross national product grew. So just to give you an idea of this swing towards the right and conservatism, look at the 1980 presidential election map. You can tell it's majority red. It's majority in favor of Reagan. So Reagan cut spending on key social welfare programs, including food stamps, school lunches, aids to family with dependent children, and Medicaid, while increasing spending on military efforts and providing tax incentives to corporations that collaborated with the military. At the same time, the Reagan administration eased restrictions on the forming of trusts, leading to corporate mergers at a pace not seen in generations, and by the end of the decade, the top 1% of families controlled 42% of the nation's wealth. So what that means is more and more money going into fewer hands. The growing concentration of wealth created a culture fascinated with money, greed, luxury, and melodrama, which was reflected in television shows like Dallas and Dynasty, and in films such as Wall Street. Alongside skyrocketing wealth came a growing gap between the rich and the poor, with poverty affecting 33 million Americans, rates of homelessness rising, and the middle class shrinking in size. The Reagan administration signaled a change for agencies concerned with environmental protection, consumer protection, and occupational safety, as many of their key functions were shifted to states. Here's Reagan for you, just to give you an idea of what he looked like. This is while he was on his presidential campaign in 1980. Labor organizations, they took a blow as well in 1981 when air traffic controllers went on strike for better wages and conditions. Reagan responded by firing the striking workers and hiring new controllers. Anti-labor sentiment fueled the growing wealth gap as unions were no longer able to effectively fight for better wages. In 1984, Reagan easily defeated his Democratic challenger, former Vice President Walter Mondale, and this guy, he made like a noteworthy contribution to American politics because when he ran for the president, he selected Geraldine Ferraro as his running mate, making her the first woman to run for a national office on a major party ticket. So that was a first. Although they don't win, we do see women kind of coming more to the forefront of American politics. So during Reagan's second term, he emphasized foreign policy and he increased defense spending as the Cold War continued. His economic policies contributed to a growing federal deficit, which was $2.8 trillion by 1989. And his conservatism reshaped the Supreme Court with the appointment of Sandra Day O'Connor in 1981 and the elevation of William Rehnquist to Chief Justice in 1986. Oops. The New Right had a strong foothold during the Reagan years as the president promoted its agenda by pushing for the removal of evolution and sex education from schoolrooms, promoting opposition to abortion, and fighting homosexuality. Gays and lesbians, inspired by the gay liberation movement that had expanded over the 1970s, increasingly fought for their rights and faced violent retribution. In addition, in the early 1980s, doctors identified a disease called acquired immune deficiency syndrome, which we refer to as AIDS, that at first primarily affected gay men. Because the initial cases were largely isolated within the gay community, New Right conservatives argued that the disease was punishment for their homosexuality. By the early 1990s, the disease had spread well beyond the gay community, and the medical community had begun to make significant progress in extending the lives of AIDS patients. Immigration was also on the rise in the 1970s and 80s, with the bulk of new arrivals coming from Latin America, the Caribbean, and Southern and Eastern Asia. The new wave of immigration drew hostility from the New Right, who expressed concerns that immigrants were taking jobs and failing to embrace mainstream American culture. The Reagan administration facilitated legislation that allowed undocumented immigrants to stay in the United States while they worked to become legal, but they punished employers who hired illegal immigrants. So you can stay here and work, but those that have hired you will be punished because you're illegal. So it's kind of a contradiction to itself. The measure was designed to appeal to Latino voters in the Southwest while appeasing anti-immigrant advocates. So here is a graph for you showing when that legislation was passed, allowing undocumented immigrants to stay here. You can tell the spike in the number of immigrants coming in the thousands at the end of the 1980s. So we're going to shift over and we're going to look at international policy now. We're focusing more on domestic, what was happening here in the U.S. We're going to look at a bigger scope now. So the evil empire. This is Ronald Reagan's approach to the Cold War. It was significantly harsher than that of former presidents, and he described the Soviet Union as the evil empire and the focus of evil in the modern world. His attitude was reflected in how much we're going to spend on defense, and we spend about $257 billion by the end of his administration. Reagan proposed a strategic defense initiative dubbed Star Wars that would send anti-ballistic missiles into orbit, so into space, and the government spent $17 billion on research for the highly criticized science fiction-like weapon system, but made no progress. Hoping to project strength, though, Reagan proposed a zero-option strategy to push the Soviets to disarm certain missiles in exchange for the United States agreement not to deploy medium-range missiles. And the Soviets actually surprised Reagan by accepting the deal. And so Reagan inaugurated strategic arms reduction talks, also referred to as START, in 1982. The United States offered to cease the deployment of particular missiles if the Soviet Union would dismantle intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Eastern Europe, but the Soviets are going to end up rejecting the proposal. In spite of efforts to reduce tensions in the face of Reagan's hard-line approach, the Cold War intensified when a Soviet fighter jet shot down a South Korean airplane carrying 269 passengers. The plane had drifted into Soviet airspace by accident and was shot down because of a series of Soviet mistakes, but Reagan used the incident to suggest that the Soviet Union had bad intentions. The United States retaliated by sending missiles into Western Europe, and the Soviets withdrew from the arms control talks and boycotted the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. So Reagan, he often fought communism at the expense of human rights, and like Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon before him, he exploited the fear of communism to protect the nation's sphere of influence in Latin America. In the process, he violated the sovereignty of nations, seeking to break out of cycles of poverty. In Nicaragua, a group of revolutionaries called the National Liberation Front, or Sandinistas, ousted their dictator with the initial support of the Carter administration. And as the Sandinistas developed a close relationship with Cuba, the Reagan administration came to believe that they were Soviet proxies. In 1982, Reagan directed the CIA to fund counter-revolutions, or revolutionaries, known as Contras, to overthrow them, but the Contras behaved in a brutal fashion, killing civilians and devastating the Nicaraguan infrastructure. So in 1982, Congress passed the Boland Amendment, banning the U.S. government from assisting the Contras and disrupting Reagan's efforts to overthrow the Sandinistas. In spite of the Boland Amendment, though, Reagan found an alternative way to continue funding the Contra War. In an effort known as Project Democracy, Reagan ordered the CIA and National Security Council, also known as the NSC, to raise money to fund Contra troops. In El Salvador, The Reagan administration supported a brutal regime that employed death squads to murder 40,000 people who had protested against the government. Reagan declared that the rebels in El Salvador were supported by the Sandinistas in Cuba, and the United States spent over $5 billion to support the El Salvadorian military. Reagan's policies also brought a lot of opposition at home, and teach-ins, marches, and rallies consumed college campuses in the mid-1980s. However, in spite of domestic support for ordinary Salvadorians and other victims of violent regimes, most of those who fled their countries were denied asylum in the United States. In 1983, Reagan ordered an invasion of the Caribbean island of Grenada to prevent a coup from affecting American medical students. The United States triumphed, and Reagan's popularity rose as he put a pro-American government in power. Reagan prioritized anti-communism over human rights, and his administration made an ideological distinction between non-communist authoritarian regimes, which were acceptable, and communist totalitarian regimes, which were not. In South Africa, where apartheid, a severe form of racial segregation, ruled, the South African Communist Party fought the white totalitarian government, which led Reagan to express his support for the regime. The nation boasted significant wealth and natural resources, which is really what was behind Reagan's interests. In 1986, Congress passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which Reagan vetoed. Congress overrode the veto, reflecting the popular support for the legislation. Then in 1983, a suicide bomber attacked U.S. troops stationed in Lebanon, killing 283 soldiers. Though Reagan subsequently withdrew the remaining troops, tensions in the Middle East continued to mount. Terrorism was a significant threat to American interests in the Middle East, with 17 deaths and 154 injuries in 1985 alone. Attacks included the hijacking of an airliner in Athens and an Italian cruise ship in the Mediterranean. Both incidents involved hostages, and one American was killed. Reagan responded by blaming the Libyan military dictator, who offered refuge for terrorists and who attacked American forces near Libya. In addition to placing an embargo, Reagan also sent U.S. military planes to West Berlin that resulted in significant casualties. However, the dictator remained in power in Libya, but he's going to end up laying low. In the Middle East, the Reagan administration offered support to Iraq in its ongoing war with neighboring Iran, but Reagan engaged with Iran as well, and in 1985, Reagan's national security advisor secretly sold anti-tank missiles to Iran in exchange for the nation's efforts to free 7 Americans who had been kidnapped by Iran-backed Shiite Muslims. Just to give you an idea about where we're talking about, right? Because a lot of people don't know world geography very well here in the U.S., but here's Libya. Over here, here's Egypt, Saudi Arabia, here's Qatar. So these are the different areas that we're talking about, and this is what we in the United States consider the Middle East. So Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, he's an aide to the National Security Council. He devised a plan to divert funds from the sale of tanks to Iran to the Contras in Nicaragua as a way around the Boland Amendment. With Reagan's support, the arms for hostages arrangement transferred between $10 and $20 million from Iran to Nicaragua. And the Iran-Contra scandal was uncovered in 1986, and the Senate held hearings that led to the indictments of NSC advisor Vice Admiral John Poindexter, North, and several others. Though the scandal was the most extreme case of government misconduct since Watergate, Reagan emerged relatively unscathed, in part because he expressed confusion and forgetfulness about the whole thing. Although we know that he knew, he pretended that he didn't know. Anti-nuclear protests were widespread in the early 1980s, placing pressure on the Reagan administration to ease international tensions and reduce armaments. Women were at the forefront of the anti-nuclear campaign, and peace camps in England in 1981 inspired the Women's Encampment for a Future of Peace and Justice at Seneca Falls, New York, which captured the public's attention. The year 1980 saw the inception of the Nuclear Freeze movement, which called for the cessation of production, or the ceasing of production of nuclear weapons, and in 1982 some 750,000 people participated in the largest peace demonstration in U.S. history in New York City's Central Park. The United Nations adopted a nuclear freeze resolution, and a measure to institute an immediate freeze nearly passed the House of Representatives. The nuclear freeze movement and momentum in religious circles, and even influenced Barry Goldwater, who declared that the nation had developed a sufficient arsenal. By 1982, 57% of Americans favored a nuclear freeze, and the 1983 television drama The Day After offered a harrowing glimpse into the aftermath of a nuclear attack on the United States. Reagan responded by working for a degree of disarmament, but he credited European activists with inspiring his efforts. Nothing that we were doing here inspired him, apparently. Reagan's second term was marked by a significant de-escalation of Cold War tensions that was brought about by a combination of Reagan's political conservatism and his anti-communist credentials, and the prioritization of pragmatism over dogma. The Soviet Union underwent a pronounced transformation in the mid-1980s with a new leader, Gorbachev, taking power and implementing a program of openness and restructuring. Gorbachev began to allow democratic elections, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press as part of an effort to reduce tensions with the United States and re-engage with the rest of the world. And the two leaders, Reagan and Gorbachev, met in person on several occasions, including a summit in Iceland in 1986, where they agreed on weapon reductions. Gorbachev offered to eliminate all of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons in exchange for the United States ending the Star Wars program, but Reagan declined. In 1987, the United States and the Soviet Union signed an Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which called for a reduction of the stockpile of intermediate-range missiles and the implementation of on-site inspections. By 1987, Reagan's attitude toward the Soviet Union had shifted, and the Cold War was coming to a close. And then in 1988, George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president, won the presidency over Democratic challenger Michael Dukakis by embracing conservative principles such as low taxes, opposition to abortion, gun rights, and the death penalty. Bush inherited a growing deficit, which culminated in a recession in 1990, with unemployment reaching 7% and states forced to make cuts to the social, health, and educational programs that were now their responsibility. Bush reneged on a campaign promise and raised taxes to reduce the deficit. He also frustrated his fellow conservatives by signing the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. Though he signed the Clean Air Act in 1990, Bush continued to support the oil industry after the Exxon Valdez tanker spilled oil into Prince William Sound in Alaska, and he opposed limitations on greenhouse gases. Bush contributed to the conservative transformation of the Supreme Court with the appointment of Clarence Thomas in 1991. Thomas, an African-American, filled the vacancy left by Thurgood Marshall. And Thurgood Marshall, he was the first black Supreme Court justice. There is opposition to Clarence Thomas, though. Just FYI, there's Anita Hill who's going to testify against him. And I believe that's mentioned once you get in the book and start reading the book, too. When George H.W. Bush took office in 1988, he encountered a world that was in transformation. Beginning with Poland, where a dock worker led the Solidarity movement, nations in the Soviet sphere pushed for democratic freedoms, and Gorbachev obliged, offering sovereignty to all Warsaw Pact nations in 1989. In the following year, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia all broke away from the Soviet Union and communist control. In Romania, the dictator fought back but was overthrown and executed. So as the geographic structure of the Soviet Union broke down, so too did the nation's most stark symbols, including the Berlin Wall, which fell in November of 1989. As the Soviet Empire came apart, the Soviet-Afghan War came to a close. The ensuing civil war in Afghanistan left the country devastated and propelled to power the Taliban, a group of Sunni Muslim fundamentalists that harbored rebels such as Osama bin Laden. In 1990, free elections in the Soviet Union brought challenges to the Gorbachev administration, with Yeltsin leading the push for capitalism. In 91, a coup led to Gorbachev being put under house arrest, and after he was released, he's going to resign. That's going to allow Boris Yeltsin to rise to power, and he brought about free market reforms and expanded the Russian democracy. As the Cold War ended, President Bush and Gorbachev signed START I, and in 1993, Bush and Yeltsin signed START II, in which the two nations agreed to dismantle their multiple warhead intercontinental missiles within 10 years. So the aftermath of the Cold War saw the emergence of an age of competition and globalization, or the building of political, economic, and cultural networks. Russia's new participation in the G8, formerly the G7, with the United States, the United Kingdom, France, West Germany, Italy, Japan, and Canada consolidated global power and production. As globalization gained momentum, so too did the development of multinational corporations, or corporations that have production and service facilities in more than one country. Over the last 3 decades of the 20th century, the number of multinational corporations jumped from 7,000 to over 60,000, and included American companies such as McDonald's and Walmart, and foreign companies such as Toyota and Honda. Globalization was manifested in popular culture as well, with reality shows like American Idol migrating to the United States from Britain. In addition, cable channels emerged to cater to specific audiences, including the Cable News Network, or CNN, the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, and Al Jazeera, an Arabic language channel. So this is the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. So you can see, you can go through and read all of these, but here we have like the Berlin Wall fells, and eventually we're going to have a united Germany again. We won't have an East and a West Germany. Here, this is where they are overthrowing communist regimes. Commonwealth of Independent States, you can tell as you get a little bit closer into Russia, and then all these in yellow are former republics of the Soviet Union. So back to this New World Order though. Organized labor suffered in the context of globalization, with union membership hitting a low of 12.5% of the industrial workforce in 2004. And workers in unregulated factories around the world were paid low wages, and products were also unregulated, particularly in China. Production and globalization fueled pollution around the world. The landscape and atmosphere of developing nations was changed as forests were depleted and factories spewed byproducts into the air and water. The use of coal, petroleum, nuclear power, and electricity, along with large gas-guzzling vehicles, fueled environmental change in industrialized nations. Environmental change facilitated a process of global warming that began to melt the polar ice caps and threaten the well-being of humans and animals. So industrialized nations signed the Kyoto Protocol, which attempted to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The U.S. Senate failed to ratify the treaty, however. Globalization also brought attention to the mounting AIDS crisis, with 33.2 million affected with the disease by the turn of the century. As the crisis spread, medical treatment improved, and the United Nations and World Health Organization offered relief to countries that were heavily impacted by the disease. The dissolution of the Soviet Union created a power vacuum in world affairs, and changes around the world began to assuage long-standing conflicts. The United States was limited in its ability to fill this vacuum. When 200,000 Chinese students and intellectuals protesting in Tiananmen Square were violently suppressed, the United States did nothing. President Bush issued a temporary ban on sales with China, but even this ended once public outrage over the Tiananmen Square massacre subsided. In Panama, the United States clung to a tenuous relationship with General Noriega, who helped the CIA support the Contras but also forged an alliance with Cuba. Noriega also aided the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency at the same time that he worked with Latin American drug lords, leading grand juries in Florida to indict him on drug smuggling and bribery charges. The United States attempted to spur a coup against him, increasing U.S. tensions with Nicaragua and prompting Bush to launch Operation Just Cause. On December 29, 1989, 27,000 Marines invaded Panama and captured Noriega, who stood trial in Florida and was sent to prison in 92. In 1990, the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded neighboring Kuwait with 100,000 troops so that Iraq could use Kuwait's oil resources to rebuild its economy. Bush responded by organizing an international coalition to stop Iraq from gaining control of a quarter of the world's oil supply and pushing further into Saudi Arabia, a key U.S. ally. Bush gave Hussein a deadline of January 15th of 91 to withdraw from Kuwait, and in spite of public opposition, Bush asked Congress to approve the use of military against Iraq. Hussein ignored the deadline, and Bush inaugurated Operation Desert Storm on January 16th of 1991, launching air attacks on Baghdad and other Iraqi cities. After Hussein continued to refuse to surrender and to remove troops from Kuwait, 500,000 ground troops moved into Kuwait on February 24th, 91, and drove Iraqi forces out of that country within 100 hours. Once the Iraqi troops were out of Kuwait, Bush resisted pressure to topple Hussein's regime, valuing the preservation of U.S. oil interests in the Middle East. Though the United States accomplished its goal of liberating Kuwait, Hussein brutalized Iraqi rebels and slaughtered Kurds and Shiites, prompting the Bush administration to enact a policy of containment. After the success of American intervention in the Iraq War, President Bush sought to help end the continued conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. The resulting peace talks ended with a 1993 agreement for eventual Palestinian self-government in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Bush's popularity ratings were low by the end of his term, and he faced a significant challenge from Arkansas Governor William Jefferson Clinton, who we call Bill Clinton. Clinton positioned himself as a centrist, supporting raising taxes on the wealthy, the death penalty, welfare reform, and a strong criminal justice system. Also running for president in 92 was Texas businessman Ross Perot, who won 19% of the popular vote as an independent candidate and contributed to Clinton's easy victory. So this is where the chapter ends. And what we're going to look at in the last chapter that we're going to cover, we kind of talked a little bit about globalization and how it's going to affect U.S. politics and U.S. diplomacy. And we're going to continue looking at the challenges of a globalized world in our next chapter that we go over, and the final chapter that we'll cover this semester.